I've been in LA, then I went up to Northern California, and now I've just got back to LA. So seeing friends and family. It's been quite a trip. It'll be good to get back, but it's been quite a trip.
Sounds good. Okay, we're on YouTube.
Yes, we are.
We start. Okay, Melissa is here, and okay. Thirteen participants. Okay, welcome everybody. This is the Housing Committee of Community Board 7. I'm Louisa Craddock, I'm the chair. And the other members of the committee, do you want to say your names, Robert?
Robert Espier.
Other people?
Oh, Melissa Rosenberg.
Madelyn Innocent.
Ira Mitchneck.
Kristina?
I'm just got in. Is this the point where we are all saying our own names? Did I miss it?
Okay. And we have a speaker tonight, Ted Houghton, and he is the president of Gateway Housing. He's going to talk to us about that. It's a nonprofit dealing specifically with new ways to provide housing for homeless persons. He, before this, was the executive deputy commissioner of the New York State Homes and Community Renewal Program. And before that, the executive director of the Supporting Housing Network. So he has a lot of information and knowledge that he can share with us. So if you'd like to start, Ted.
Okay. Yeah. So I've spent 30 years in and out of government and nonprofits working on homelessness and affordable housing issues, and everything related to that. And homelessness is kind of the nexus of all the different systems failures. So, you know, that it's a fairly broad portfolio of things I've been able to get involved in. I worked at the Coalition for the Homeless, the Department of Homeless Services, have consulted and, you know, ran the Supportive Housing Network, which represented all the nonprofits that do supportive housing, and also was number 2 at the New York State Division of Housing and Homes and Community Renewal. The last few years, I've been running something called Gateway Housing, which is a nonprofit that provides technical assistance to nonprofits and government around new ways to do things with homelessness and housing. We've focused on new ways to help nonprofits to finance shelter development so that they can be the developer and the owner of the shelter. And this way they would be able to create a shelter that they could be proud of and they would own, and it would be a better investment for taxpayers because it wouldn't be, you know, paying rent to a private landlord and then 10 years later they raise the rent even more. This way it's an actual investment that strengthens the finances of the nonprofit and gives us a shelter we can be proud of that we can use for generations rather than just the length of the lease. From that, we started working on a similar long-term contract, 30-year contract that only is available to nonprofits that would allow the nonprofit to finance permanent housing using a contract financing. And we've worked with the city to create that. They now have the purpose-built shelter contract, which can be used by nonprofits to build shelters, and they have the master lease contract, which is a misnomer of sorts that allows the nonprofit to own the housing and to create housing. we worked on, improving programs in shelters where we had an innovative program to improve homeless children's school attendance that we worked with a number of nonprofits, Canva, Help USA, Bronx Works, and WIN, where we brought Department of Education staff and shelter staff together using new technology and new data to figure out which children are not going to school, and then work in a team approach to address the issues that surround that, whether they're logistical like transportation mix-ups or something more deep-seated like familial dysfunction, substance abuse, and so on. We had some success, and many of the things we learned are now being implemented by the Department of Education and the Department of Homeless Services there. The last couple years, I've been focused a lot on the opportunity around distressed hotels. New York City has invested in an enormous amount of affordable housing, particularly for homeless people. We have built probably about 35,000 units of supportive housing over the last 40 years, which is really extraordinary and much more than any other locality has done. On the other hand, we've lost about 100,000 units of supportive housing, of SRO housing, single room occupancy housing that many of us on the West Side are familiar with. We've lost those units, and so we haven't been able to build as quickly as we have lost units. And I was starting to despair, and while the pandemic has been horrific and I wouldn't wish it on anybody, it does provide us with an opportunity to catch up by continuing to build as much supportive housing as we have been, and a little bit more. And I'm hoping that this administration will increase the amount of homeless housing, permanent housing with supportive services that they create. But in addition to that, take a number of the distressed hotels and transform them not into shelters, as we've seen again and again, but to actually buy them and allow the nonprofits to own them and turn them into permanent supportive housing. Using these hotels, it essentially is recreating what happened in the 70s, where a lot of people with mental illness and otherwise marginalized populations found their way into hotels and started living there as housing. Only this time we can create a much nicer kitchenette. We can make them rent stabilized tenants. We can really fix them up, and we can do it at half the cost. We'll get micro apartments, but it's really half the cost and half the time of what we spend creating supportive housing. If we can do this over and above what we're already doing, creating ground up new construction supportive housing, we might be able to catch up. And so I've been working a lot with the city to try to get funding, and the state to get funding for hotels, for hotel conversions. We got $200 million in the Honda Fund, which is the Housing Our Neighbors with Dignity Act, a law that was passed last year. And they gave $100 million in there last year and then put in another $100 million. But nobody's been able to use that money because the regulatory relief that we need to see to convert hotels into permanent housing is just not there. And so right now I'm trying to help advocates and electeds and the city and, pretty much all the stakeholders to get this one amendment to the multiple dwelling law passed that would allow us to convert hotels into housing quickly. Because otherwise they're going to be converted into shelter, and the same people are going to live there, only they're going to live in an institutional setting that has people coming and going on a crisis basis. And it's really not going to be good for the residents. It's not going to be good for the surrounding community. It's just not housing, and we want to create homes. So I'm hoping that we get this law passed in the next couple of weeks. We have a good chance, knock on wood. And if that happens, then a number of hotels could be converted into permanent housing. They could be bought by the nonprofits using contract financing and other funds from the city and state, and take people who need homes and move them in. And the best model for this is what we're doing on 97th Street and Broadway, where I helped the Fortune Society purchase the Royal Park Hotel, which was an illegal hotel on 97th Street. And we're going to preserve it. And the Fortune Society now owns it. And we're going to move some formerly homeless people in there. We're going to preserve the 15 tenants that are existing already will have their homes preserved and protected and fixed up. And we're going to do a moderate rehab of the building and be able to turn that into permanent supportive housing. The reason we were able to convert that hotel, is the only one in New York City that we've done so far, is because it was operating as an illegal hotel and it has a housing certificate of occupancy. If this law passes, then it will allow hotels with hotel certificates of occupancy under certain specific conditions be used as affordable housing, provided they jump through a bunch of hoops to make sure that it's high quality housing. New York City's experience contrasts badly with California. In California, shortly after the pandemic hit, around in June of 2020, myself and some others made presentations to the city of San Francisco and the city of New York about the opportunity to purchase and convert hotels. San Francisco and California jumped in. New York City said, we don't have enough money, and nothing happened. We finally got Honda passed, and now we're hoping to get this regulatory relief passed. But California passed the regulatory relief and put in over $1 billion to purchase over 100 hotels, and they're now being converted into 6,000 units of permanent housing, affordable, supportive for formerly homeless people. So we're trying to get going. I don't think we'll ever catch up to California, but there is an opportunity to convert a few hundred, if not a couple of thousand hotel units, I'm hoping, with the new resources and new regulatory relief, if that happens. So that's essentially what I've been working on. I'm happy to answer any questions or, engage in any kind of conversation about this. I'd like to hear from the community board what your thoughts are on all this, and be very interested in knowing what you're seeing there.
I raised my hand, so I don't know should I just speak?
Oh, wait.
How do we do this? You want me to just start?
Raising hands is great, but you can jump in too.
Okay, yeah. So that thanks a lot. What you're presenting is parallel pretty perfectly to what we've been discussing in the committee, even before I came on, which was 2012, and began with a research, an excellent research by a student from one of the planning schools, who surveyed all of the SROs and the different supportive housing available, the privately owned, and so on. And then in this iteration, beginning 6 months or so ago, then we said, let's look at that again, but let's identify who are the owners and what are the possibilities? Because of course, the owner is the issue. How do you persuade the owner and the cough is drying up with respect to the subsidies and all of that kind of stuff. How do you bend this owner to convert his property into affordable housing and permanent housing for the SRO? So this is really right on time, Louisa. Now, the question I have first, and I'll have others down the way, is that how was California able to bundle those hotels to, it was a policy thing from the top. So
yeah.
California is different in that way. So I guess the question answers itself. By the way, also, and you're familiar with this, in Barcelona, a vacant hotel can be seized by the city. Are you vacant? You don't have no one living there? We have people on the street, that municipality, because that's a different government and a different social system. In any event, can you talk a little more about how California was able to do that, to generate, did you say 1,000 units?
No, 6,000.
6,000.
1,000. Can you tell us a little more about that, the mechanism, how it worked?
Yeah.
And what features they have that you might adapt here?
I've spoken to some people in California. I know a little bit about the housing and homeless systems in California, but I'm not an expert. Mm-hmm. But Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, has long been interested in supportive housing since when he was mayor of San Francisco, and so I think he provided the necessary leadership that was missing. And he also went out on a limb to override local zoning in a way that New York State is much more reluctant to do, and for good or bad. And so they provided some modest regulatory relief that allowed hotels to be used as housing. And then they took $800 million of the first tranche of their CARES Act money. So the federal dollars that came in the first wave of responding to COVID, they took 800 million of that and put it towards this. They've added a few $100 million of state dollars since then. At the same time, New York used their COVID money to open up more shelters and to use hotels as shelters.
Yeah.
And they spent a lot of FEMA dollars and other things. And I don't know, I'm not positioned to judge whether the other needs weren't important. I'm sure they were, but it just so happened that California had a governor, and they also have a very visible street homelessness problem here that wasn't nearly as apparent 5 years ago. We all thought it was bad 5 or 10 years ago, but it's unbelievable. I'm just driving down Sunset Boulevard, one of the main streets of Los Angeles, and there are tent cities on Sunset Boulevard. It's really unbelievable how the street homelessness problem has ballooned here. And I think that does a lot to create political will. New York City has a right to shelter. So we have similar numbers of homeless, but in New York City, 95% of the homeless New Yorkers are in shelter, where we have 2,000 to 4,000 homeless people living in public spaces. In California, it's the reverse. 70% of their homeless are on the streets, living underpasses, on the beach, and on street corners. It's really, really quite apparent. And the same goes with San Francisco, where San Francisco and New York City have similar numbers of street homeless. But San Francisco is 1/10 the size of New York City. So you really notice it. So I think that had a lot to do with creating the political will and to override local zoning. There had been a big movement already where California had long recognized that local zoning rules were preventing affordable housing development in general. Right. And so there was a real movement to that, whereas New York City and New York State have been much more welcoming of affordable housing development over the years. We're much more used to it. And so there hasn't been this movement to push back against local zoning restrictions because we actually have been able to build a lot of affordable housing. Not enough, but a lot.
I'd like to ask about the zoning restrictions, because I've looked at the Kavanaugh bill and I am confused by it. First of all, any hotel that's in a commercial district, as you know, can be used for residential use as long as there's a change of the C of O. One of the main things that I saw, and I would appreciate if you would talk about the different zoning and regulatory restrictions that they're talking about. The one about 400 feet from a residential zone would be considered residential. Are they talking then about M1 manufacturing zones? Because it seems to me there's a problem of putting hotels in manufacturing zones which are not necessarily near shops, food stores. They're more isolated. It's like when they used to build projects, you know, kind of away from the main part of town.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious about that and what else they're talking about when they're talking about this. Because one other thing, it seems to me we do not want to recreate SROs. What we do want to create are studios and apartments for people where they can live permanently. So I get a little worried when they say that we're going to skip zoning regulations and building regulations that require certain things for residences.
Yeah, and that's a reasonable thing to ask. I mean, I think that we want to be careful about zoning and building codes, zoning regulations and building codes. So the Kavanaugh bill does two things very simply by amending the multiple dwelling law, the state law that oversees New York's building codes and everything. It does two very distinct things. One is around zoning. Right now, hotels are in commercial or residential zones, and those zones allow residential uses, residential, of course, and commercial as well. So if the hotel is in a residential or a commercial zone, you know, the Kavanaugh bill doesn't change anything except for around building codes, and we'll get to that in a second. However, about 200 hotels were built in M1 light manufacturing districts, not heavy industry, but light manufacturing districts. And that stopped in about, I want to say 2017, but maybe 2018, 19, somewhere around there. The city council passed a law saying that hotels could no longer be built in M1 light manufacturing districts without a special permit from the city council. And this was really coming from the hotel union, the hotel workers union,
Right.
Because most of the hotels that were being built in light manufacturing zones were non-union, smaller hotels. And so they wanted to stop that, and they did. Not one hotel has been built in a light manufacturing zone since that law was passed. So there are 200 or so existing hotels in M1 light manufacturing zones. I'm sure a couple of them are very isolated from residential neighborhoods, but most of them are quite close to residential neighborhoods. I think that there's a rule here that says it has to be within 400 feet of a residential zone. That's like a block and a half or something. And I think that
2 blocks.
What's that?
It's 2 blocks, yes.
Okay, yeah, 2 blocks. And that captures about 80% of those 200 hotels, about 160 of them. There's like 40 M1 hotels in Manhattan, and you can look out the window and see luxury apartments across the street. There are M1 hotels. I can see an M1 hotel out my window in Park Slope, Brooklyn. You know, it was, yeah, I think it edged out the Upper West Side for America's #1 neighborhood in 1 year. But, so Park Slope is a very nice place to live. And this hotel is within sight of my apartment, but it's an M1 hotel. So this would allow hotels like that are close to transportation and shopping and schools and everything to be used, but not if they're farther than that. And also if they're hotels, there's about 5 to 10 hotels that are in industrial business zones, which are specially designated manufacturing areas, like the Brooklyn Navy Yard and other places. There are 5 or 10 existing hotels in those 17 industrial business zones. Those cannot be converted. We don't want to put housing in IBZs. So there's a protection there as well. And then even if you have a hotel that is in an M1 district within 400 feet, you still need to get approval from HPD to do it. HPD can decide who's going to convert which hotels into what kind of housing, and it would be completely regulated, and the tenants would have to be rent stabilized, and it would have to be deeply affordable housing as well. So there's a lot of protections there that preserve local control. It pretty much empowers the locality to control the process, because we don't want to go willy-nilly into this and just allow anybody. It has to, right now in its current form, I believe it has to be nonprofits that own and develop it, and they can do it in partnership with a joint venture. But we wanted to have that nonprofit protection in there as well. We didn't want the hotel owners just to wave a magic wand and say, sure, my hotel is housing now. We wanted it to be actually change hands into a nonprofit owned hotel.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Ethel?
Thank you.
And I think, and I'll talk about the other part of the Kavanaugh bill, which is around building codes as well. But why don't I take another question and can talk about that?
Ethel?
Thank you very much. And this was extremely informative and very good. I have 2 related questions from at the beginning of your talk. One was that you were working with the Fortune Society, and we heard their presentation and supported it and found it to be excellent. And I understood in your quick summary why that was working. It had been an illegal hotel and so on, but it's a good model and very responsible. But the second point you made is extremely important, I think. You said that there are ways, and it would be beneficial if we could move to the so-called mini dwelling, the small apartments, very, very small, and that would not be considered a hotel. It would also have a bathroom, and that kind of construction and model appeared, or you mentioned that can be very fruitful. So my question is, to what extent can we on the Upper West Side, if we have some of the housing and want to be able to improve some of the hotels, or in general, use the particular model in zoning terms too of the mini housing units as compared to the so-called SRO model?
It's almost like you planted the question, because that's what I was going to talk about next.
Okay, good. I'm so glad, because it's so interesting and important.
Yeah. So apart from the zoning around the 200 M1 hotels, we have about 600 hotels that are in residential or commercial districts like the Park Royale. And those hotels can be turned into housing, but To do so, they would have to go from the hotel building code to the housing maintenance code regulations. And that creates a lot of, there's slight differences in the two rule books, and it creates a lot of barriers to converting hotels. There was a hotel that a few nonprofits had looked at that it had 60 rooms. It was used up until the beginning of the pandemic. If you wanted to reopen it as a hotel, you know, all the fixtures and the wallpaper and the carpets are all still nice. But if you wanted to turn it into permanent housing for formerly homeless people, it didn't quite match the housing maintenance code requirements. The rooms were just 10 square feet too small. The elevator was 6 inches too shallow. The doors were 2 inches too narrow. So to convert it into housing, you would have to get all sorts of waivers that would take you a very long time, and there'd be a lot of uncertainty. You could not buy this hotel with any confidence. So essentially what the Department of Buildings said was, you can turn that hotel into housing, but you're going to have to gut rehab it. So a couple of nonprofits that saw this hotel and had architects walk through it, they wanted to turn it very quickly into 60 units of micro apartments, each with their own private bathroom, with really nice finishes and a little kitchenette. But because they were being told that it had to meet the housing maintenance code and had to get a new C of O, that 18-month renovation that was going to basically come out to about $350,000 a unit was instead going to become a gut rehab, and they were going to end up with 50 units of studio apartments that had doors that were wide enough, and they would have to put a new elevator shaft. It was going to take 5 years and $550,000 roughly to convert. And so the nonprofits said no, and another nonprofit came in and said, okay, we're going to turn it into a shelter. And so it's going to turn into a shelter, and you know, shelter and hotels are the same zoning use group. They respect the same codes. So it can be turned into a shelter overnight, but that doesn't help the community. It doesn't help the people that need homes. It's really a missed opportunity. So the Kavanaugh bill allows the hotel to keep its certificate of occupancy that it has now, but be used as housing in the same way that Upper West Side hotels were used as housing by people. That's why the Park Royale has 15 existing tenants in it, right? They started staying there and they got tenants' rights, and they're there as rent stabilized tenants. So the Kavanaugh bill will put that, make that clearly the law, and we'll be able to then touch some of these hotels that are in residential neighborhoods, but right now we can't turn them into housing because of all the building code issues.
So could we to the units? Could we move with the Kavanaugh bill or some addendum to it to be creating the mini units that you've described?
Yeah, well, that's what it would allow. So instead of like a minimum of 150 square feet of habitable space, which is the housing maintenance codes requirement, you could do 140 square feet. It's just right. Like you wouldn't notice the difference, but from a code perspective, you're either complying or you're not. And since you have to change the C of O, you wouldn't be able to grandfather in anything. This way, you could grandfather in things. With the I envision like an SRO for the 21st century, where everybody has a private bathroom and has a kitchenette. And it's a lot better than a Bowery Flophouse or an Upper West Side SRO. It's really, it's a micro apartment. And I think that a lot of people, that will be good. In the Fortune Society one, 36 of the rooms have private baths. Some of them have shared, but we're getting rid of the smallest rooms, and we're installing a kitchen and a dining area, so that if people want to get meals downstairs together, they can do that as well as eat in their rooms with their kitchenettes. And so I'd like to see what kind of creativity good nonprofits can do, and not get stuck with doing everything we can to comply with the codes, and, regardless of what the end result is.
This is something for us to lobby for and work on. I think, sorry.
I hope so. I mean, we're trying right now where we're at. Like I said, Honda created funds to convert hotels, but and they put $100 million in last year and another $100 million this year, but they have not been able to spend it because they don't have this regulatory relief. What we're able to do with the fortune societies, like we're able to grandfather in some of the conditions, that, it's a small elevator, but it's big enough. But, if we weren't able to grandfather it in, we would have to create a new shaft, and that would be no good. We're going to put some handicapped accessibility, a lift on the front stairs because it's, on a hill, and the front door has outdoor stairs, things like that are necessary to make it handicapped accessible, and make sure some of the rooms are accessible in that way, or adaptable and everything. But it gives us flexibility because we're able to keep that certificate of occupancy. And so in the same way, I'd like to do that with hotels, where, it would just be a great source of first step housing. And for some people, they'll want to stay there forever. The Times Square Hotel, the Prince George Hotel, the Geffner House are all famous supportive housing residences that were turn of the century hotels. They are all still operating under their original hotel certificates of occupancy, which back in the 90s, the Department of Buildings allowed. Now the Department of Buildings is saying that was a mistake, not a precedent. And so we have to have this change in the multiple dwelling law to clear that up. So we're really not radically changing much. We're just codifying what we've done in the past.
Okay, thank you. Ira?
Okay, I'm disappointed to hear that the DOB has backed off of their longstanding previous policy.
Not as disappointed as I was.
Having worked, I worked on the Woodstock years ago, so.
Okay, good.
Yeah. I'm an architect. Are there any other code changes you see coming that you might be able to move through?
I think that just by keeping the certificate of occupancy, I didn't want to get too into it. We wanted to have a simple solution. It's not going to get us access to every hotel, but I think it's really the size of the rooms and, what's required in the kitchens and the size of the bathrooms and everything like that. So I have seen a number of hotels that actually have fairly big rooms, and you'll have like an alcove where you can put a kitchenette, and some of them you can make the bathrooms bigger and handicapped accessible, not just adaptable, but with fully equipped with grab bars and roll-in showers and everything else that's needed. But, by keeping that certificate of occupancy, you're able to grandfather in certain existing conditions as long as you don't spend more than half the price. I think the rule is that if you're spending more than half the purchase price on construction, then you have to bring everything up to date. But if you're doing a mod rehab, you're able to get some flexibility that way.
There's some other funny little things, but I'm not going to go into the weeds.
Yeah, no, I've spent time with land use lawyers and architects, and it's sometimes a little bit over my head, but
okay. Are there any, you're just looking at the state legislature for changes. Are there any changes that you think can come through city council? Because quite honestly, I have a predilection, and I've said this on previous board meetings, that if something can be done in the New York City Council for New York City rather than by New York State, I'd much prefer to be done by the city.
Yeah, no, I think that's giving right now at this very moment, the assembly, the Senate is going to pass the law. The governor's office supports the law. The mayor had a rally last week with the Hotel Trades Council, and the city council speaker came out in favor. So the homeless advocates are in favor, the affordable housing developers, the industrial areas advocates. But the assembly is still reluctant to override local control of zoning and building codes, and I respect that. So we wanted to make sure that it was a modest change, and we wanted to make sure that we could demonstrate that that City Hall and the City Council wanted this. The City Council was about to introduce a similar bill, but by not their bill, the City Council can't amend the multiple dwelling law because that's a state law. So the City Council bill was much more narrow, and it only applied to hotels built before 1969 for some reason. I'm not exactly certain.
Because of the rent stabilization. That was why. Because I helped write the legislation.
Yeah, there you go. So it's been a while, Melissa. How are you? Carlina Rivera was going to introduce in the City Council this bill, but the concern was that it would open up a lot of union hotels to development and not touch the newer Sam Chang sliver hotels that we saw come up. And those more recent hotels are probably a better bet for redevelopment. And so the City Council is asking the state to intervene in this way, and hopefully they will. Once again, I think it's really important. Local control is important. And so the law was written, requiring an HPD regulatory agreement so that HPD could decide which would happen, and which would not, and be able to prevent and protect. And the fact is, with affordable housing, HPD is really sensitive to City Council because they have so many projects going through ULURP that they work pretty collaboratively with them. The City Council could also propose a text amendment to the zoning regulation, but that would go through ULURP itself, and so it would take a couple of years to do. And the window is already closing so quickly. We wouldn't have time to really do anything probably, unless something else bad happens in the next 2 years. I mean, knock on wood, but we'll see. But this way, the multiple dwelling law allows us to move more quickly.
Just brings me to one last question. We had one of the state legislators in here earlier in this year, whether 2021, 2022, and we kind of laughed at $100 million. So we got another $100 million, and I'm not going to laugh at $200 million as much as at $100 million, but it's still overall not a lot of money, because that's also statewide, I understand.
Yeah, 100 million. The first 100 million could only be spent in New York City. The second 100 million could be spent in New York City and anywhere else in the state.
Okay, that's
seed money. And I think it was always anticipated that this money would be combined with other affordable housing funds that we use, like tax credits and tax exempt bonds and capital. It would be great to have $1 billion and just spend the capital. what I think will really fit is this contract financing that we help the city to create, where you get a 30-year contract that the city guarantees payment, and therefore you've got this contract that says the city is going to, pay $2,000 a month per studio. And so then you can say, look, my building is going to bring in $1 million a year. You can go and to the bank and borrow against that contract. And actually, it turns out we're talking to lenders now, and it turns out that contract financing actually gets a lower interest rate than typical affordable housing loans. A typical first mortgage is actually more expensive because it's basically calculated against the risk of the building not penciling out, like the building income not coming in, not as much building income and too much building costs, property costs ongoing, like you're trying to predict what's going to happen in 20 or 30 years. And so lenders are very conscious of that. The contract financing, on the other hand, is against the full faith and credit of the city of New York. And the city of New York has a pretty good credit rating. And so this contract financing is actually opening up, financing from new lenders that are called credit tenant lease lenders that are really just, gauging their risk against the strength of the contract rather than on whether or not the property is going to perform. And so that's an added bonus. It will actually make it cheaper to borrow.
Great. Did you have any other questions, Ira?
I'm gonna call it an evening.
Okay, no, but
I hope there are other questions.
No, but another thing that reminds me, okay, so the 200 million is not nearly enough. I mean, we could spend $1 billion, and there's a hotel out in Queens that is somebody's trying to buy for $60 million. That's going to use more than half the New York City portion, right? They'll do it with a combination of financing, but what the Honda funds could be very useful is as acquisition money, because when you're building affordable housing, the way we used to do it, we used to get marginal properties and renovate them, like the old Capitol Hall or the Senate, or a couple on the Upper West Side, the Euclid and everything like that. But then property prices started going up, and pretty much now a parking lot in the Bronx is $1 million and everything. But a hotel is a fully built out property. And so, it can cost 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, $60 million up front. You don't need to spend nearly as much on construction. If you buy a parking lot and you build a new construction building, most of your money is going to go towards construction. But you buy a hotel, most of your money is going to go to acquisition. So having that $200 million of cash available to help with acquisitions is a really good, useful tool.
Is there any expectation that you can go back to the legislature and get more money before the end of the session? Because this may be a rare opportunity that may not yet show up again for another 20 or 30 years. That doesn't look like a good head shake there.
Yeah, no, I have described this as a once in a generation opportunity, and I've been seeing it slip away because, you can see that some hotels are coming back, and which is a great thing for the city. And, we need tourism and everything, but we are starting to miss the opportunity. And, the legislature asked for the Senate asked for 250 million last year. They got 100. They asked for 250 million again this year. They got 100. It's not going to be enough. And, we would have to wait till next year's budget, and next year's budget is going to be a bloodbath because this is an election year budget with lots of federal COVID dollars coursing through the system. Next year is going to be austerity It's really not going to be an easy year. And so that's disappointing, but we do have a lot of affordable housing development money. I mean, de Blasio going up to 300,000 units of affordable housing has increased the volume of the affordable housing development machine that the city and state finance. So there is money available. People will have to get in line. And I'm really hoping, I keep coming back to this contract financing, but these contracts, you're going, you would, if you did a contract to run a shelter, you would have to have an item in there to pay rent to the owner. If you use that contract, you make it a 30-year contract and you call that rent line debt service, then that allows the nonprofit to buy it. And so the same thing with permanent housing. This is housing that we were going to try to subsidize people's rent through the city FEP's housing voucher that's completely city funded. And that's just going to pay rent to private landlords, which is a good thing because it allows people to stay in their homes or move into new affordable homes. But by putting it into a 30-year contract, we're project basing it. So we're going to actually be able to create housing with money that we were already going to spend. So I'm really hopeful that that would be something that will add to the pot of money with a few $100 million more in private loans against these contracts. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to jump and grab a bunch of hotels quickly.
Great. Peter?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for this presentation and congratulations on the Fortune Society. I wanted to ask about some of the designations. We have hostels, and I don't know if they would fit into the same category. We also have, there was 2 buildings on West 107th Street between Amsterdam and Broadway that were, I believe, illegally converted into hotels a number of years ago. I know that they've been under negotiations. The Help USA is renting one of them from a predatory landlord that did stuff to it years ago. And I'm just curious whether you've looked at some of these or whether you're in communication with any of our nonprofits such as Goddard or Wisfish.
Yeah, I talk to Goddard all the time. And it's not easy to grab any of these. With the 97th Street property, the owner, Hank Freed, owned 3 properties in the area that he was using as illegal hotels. So I worked with Project Find to try to buy the Broadway Hotel on 101st Street to turn into senior housing. And we were this close to going into contract, and a speculator, a flipper, bought it out from under us. And so that's going to be market rate housing now, unfortunately, because that would have been a good one, but it was more attractive to other. The reason that the Fortune Society was able to get the Royal Park was because the Park Royale or whatever it was called was because it had 15 existing tenants, and that scared off a lot of people. The Broadway had only 5, and it had air rights that allowed it to be built bigger, and so and it had some commercial tenants as well. So it just was a more attractive property. We weren't able to get it. In terms of some of the other ones on the Upper West Side, I know that, with the SROs, it's the 97th Street was a special case because it had a lot of apartments, rooms that had private baths. And so it makes for a good mix. Whereas some of the SROs, you look at the floor plates and you just can't figure out, how could I ever turn this into studios with private baths? And, Goddard had one, I can't remember if it was the Senate or the Capitol Hall, but it was all shared bathrooms. and they did a major renovation to create studios with private baths because they prefer to run that that way. But I think that there's a combination. I know of a couple others that some of the early supportive housing, the providers did shared bathrooms, and then as time went on, we went more to now the standard, and we rarely deviate from it, is private bath for every apartment.
Got it. The other thing that I just wanted to mention for the committee is just my perspective on SROs is much more positive than what I've been hearing. The places like the Dexter House on 86th Street was a great place to live back 40 years ago. Simmons House in the 80s was a known place for women coming into the city, a safe place. And so the SROs really were a really valuable resource that got changed considerably by landlords that were that were greedy and not looking out for anybody's best interest. So I'll just leave it at that. But just the historical use of SROs was really positive in the before greed changed things. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that the SRO is actually a pretty essential part of our housing stock, and you'll find that in the affordable housing world, location applies as well. A lot of people will gladly take a much smaller apartment in Manhattan than a one bedroom in East New York, and people vote with their feet all the time. When I first moved to New York City, I went to Columbia, and my dorm room was a recently converted SRO, because Columbia was one of the landlords that went out and bought all those SROs and turned them into student housing. And that's one of the ways that we lost a lot of those essential units. My wife lived in a Barnard dorm that was half Barnard women and half SRO tenants. And, we thought that was like a cool New York slice of life thing. We loved it when we were young. It made us, it was like the big city and everything. But we've lost a lot of that to conversions like dorm rooms and luxury housing and hotels and that sort of thing. It's just the nature of things. And I'm hoping that we've learned from what happened in the 80s, and we try to grab some of these hotels to create new micro apartments to try to make up for that.
Well, thank you.
Okay, Roberta?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm chair of the Budget and Strategy Committee, and one of the things we're looking at is our district needs for the year, fiscal year 2023, both capital improvements and district capital and expense budget and district needs. And I've worked over the years, I've been privileged to work closely with Riverside, Wishfish, and Project Find. And I have a question.
3 of my favorite nonprofits.
They have been wonderful for us on the Upper West Side. But I have 2 questions for you. The first is, so if I were a building owner and I had, this building and I wanted to sell it to, could we give them a tax write-off so that they would be more inclined? Because what the problem is, if Goddard Riverside or Project Find want to buy this building and a private developer wants to buy the building, they can't buy it because the private guy has money and so
and can move more quickly, right?
Move quickly. It doesn't have to go through HPD. It doesn't have to go through, all kinds of bureaucracy. Could there be like a tax write-off for him that
there is, and I'm not sure. I want to say it's a 471 exchange or something that is available. We didn't use it. We talked about using it, offering it to the owner when we were negotiating price for the Fortune Society, and it ended up we didn't have to. We were actually competitive bidders, and we actually were able to get the money pretty quickly using the New York Acquisition Fund. But there is something there, and then there's also the 1031 exchange, which is if you're a billionaire building owner, you sell a building, and if you buy another building within a year, you don't have to pay taxes. And so there are, I'm talking to some private developer families to see that have 1031 exchange needs, and so they might actually contribute some money and be a minority owner to a nonprofit because it's tax advantage to them. And so we're exploring that to see if that might be something we can do. Also, nonprofits can get the 420C tax exemption for supportive housing, and that makes it doesn't help us with the acquisition price, but it helps us when we're trying to pencil out the 30-year underwriting. So nothing obvious. The 471, which I may be getting the number wrong, is an interesting one. But it relates to essentially structuring it so that this purchase price that you'd agreed on is $1 million or $2 million or $3 million less, and so therefore you're getting a tax break because you're essentially donating that portion to the nonprofit, is the idea. I haven't been able to make it work yet, but that is one of the things that we look at.
And my second question is, we are working on our district needs and capital expense budgets for fiscal year 2023. So any information you can provide us. And one of our three top issues are, of course, public affordable housing.
Always, yes.
It's been for years. The fact 25% of our community is food insecure.
Yeah.
And education and programs for youth. But on the housing issue, anything that you could provide us that would be helpful, because within the next 2 months, we will be working on our district needs for the fiscal year 2023.
Well, I mean, I'm really conscious that all of you are probably better versed in this, in thinking in terms of a community needs as opposed to citywide or statewide.
But there may be statewide.
We're always looking for more capital for housing, and right now is a good time for people to say that we need it. The mayor is developing his housing and homelessness plan right now, and on the campaign trail, he promised to spend $4 billion a year on affordable housing between NYCHA and HPD. And his first year budget is at $2.2 billion, which he is characterizing as a record-setting amount. And it is, but it's just not enough. And so, especially when you factor in NYCHA's needs. So the more that you can argue for capital, that's great. We had a lot of success getting the city FEPS vouchers brought up to HUD fair market rent standards, which make them more competitive. So that's good, but the city has to get those vouchers out, and they have to help people find housing. And one of the things that we're seeing is that the Department of Homeless Services and HRA, Human Resources Administration, they really are short on staff. HPD as well. They just don't have enough lawyers to close all the housing deals. They don't have enough staff to help approve all eligibility for people to move into housing. So we're seeing a really high vacancy rate, historically high vacancy rate in supportive housing right now. where it was always around 5% of the units. Now it's above 10%. And mostly that's related to the fact that the Department of Homeless Services, HPD, and HRA just don't have enough staff working on this. I feel like, any time that you're doing belt tightening, you got to preserve anything that helps people get into housing more quickly, because shelter is so expensive and homelessness is associated with such high healthcare and mental health costs that, you should be spending as much money as necessary just to get people into housing where they'll be more stable.
We will be in touch with you to help us with this, if you don't mind.
Always happy to help. I mean, like I said, all of you, I'm sure, are the experts, but I'm happy to put our heads together.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I have a question, which is that we're talking about micro units, but when you're talking about hotel conversions, is there any thought of conversions that would accommodate families, more than one person?
I'm sure that is a possibility. I think that, in terms of the regulatory relief that I've been concentrating on, it's been about trying to facilitate quick conversions. I think that if you did families, you would probably be more likely to go to a gut rehab and to change the floor plate. I did look at one hotel where, you could try to do sort of a Jack and Jill door, and you could make, one bathroom, one room would keep the bathroom as is. The other one, you turn the bathroom into a kitchen, and you would have a 1-bedroom kind of apartment.
Okay.
Between the two hotel rooms. So I'm hoping that somebody comes through with that. I think a lot of times with affordable housing development, it's really, you got to create some firm rules and parameters, but then allow a lot of room for creativity, because you really don't know what people are going to bring you. And, depending on the population they're serving, those populations have different needs. And so I'm really hoping somebody comes in and says, I want to do family housing, or I want to do a mix of single adults and families, which is something that a lot of nonprofits are doing in regular supportive housing now. So it's possible. It's just not as obvious.
Okay, thank you. Roberta, did you have another question? Your hand is up.
Sorry.
Does anyone have any other questions? Okay, thank you, Ted. I have learned so much.
Okay, well, I appreciate you being interested. And I mean, CB7 has always been one of the very best community boards. So I appreciate your interest and diligence in this.
Yay!
And I know a lot of community boards over the years.
I'm sure you do. No, we
Ted,
appreciate.
can Ted recite his phone number?
You can get me anytime. It's Ted Houghton, Houghton, and I'm with Gateway Housing, and my number is 917-309-4566. And
Thank you.
You can call me anytime.
Thanks a lot. Good.
Available for advice and.
Yeah, I need advice.
Sure.
I'm going to make an appointment with you, Ted, on a separate project, but along the lines of what we're talking about. But I'll visit you and make an appointment and go over the whole thing.
Okay, I'm back in New York later at the end of this week. So
okay, terrific.
But happy to do it. I'm very interested in what people are coming up with.
You'll like what you hear.
Okay, good.
And I hope you let us know the minute that you hear of possibilities of conversions on the Upper West Side. The study that Robert mentioned in the beginning, we are trying to get a graduate intern who can update it and extend it to include hotels as well as SROs, as well as ownership information, etc.
Do you have funding for that kind of a project?
We're hoping to do a stipend for a graduate student at Columbia.
Louisa, we don't have funding.
Okay, so
Oh, in the past, we had city council funding. But Borough President's office funded the student in the past. And
so the city council and borough president is probably the first place I would look.
Well, no, excuse me. We had funding for the FCMY. What I'm in contact with Columbia and the possibility of it being a thesis subject.
Yeah, that'd be great.
For a graduate student in planning at Columbia.
Yep.
That'd be great.
Yep.
And let them do a deep dive into it, and we could use that information. Be very good.
All right, good.
Yeah.
Louisa, I have a really basic question, which doesn't really need to be answered now, but I'm wondering like what the best ways of learning for just anyone in the community to learn about the underlying causes of either homelessness or the need for supportive housing. And you mentioned before, I think you had said something like, supportive housing is, a mix of a number of issues leading to people needing supportive housing. And just at a real basic level, are there any good reports or studies showing, and I see Peter has thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you my 60-second elevator spiel, but I mean, and there's so many reports, but they're all so specialized that a lot of times you stop seeing the forest for the trees. But I mean, we had 93,000 people in state psychiatric hospitals back in 1955, and then they invented Thorazine and they let most of them out. And for most of them, it was a great success. A lot of people went to the Upper West Side and the Bowery and ended up in SROs and were okay until 1980 or so when we started seeing a lot of conversions. And, SROs, new construction of SROs by private developers was outlawed in 1966. So it really was a combination of, deinstitutionalization, but really then the housing that people found started disappearing. Now we're seeing the family homelessness is driven just by economics. I mean, 25% of the heads of households in the family shelter system are working now, and they just can't afford rent because we've added 1.5 million people over the last 30 years, and we've only built like 300,000 units of housing or so. So there's just not enough housing and housing has become so expensive that, working people no longer can afford it, and let alone people that are on public assistance. On the single adult side, we're seeing homelessness continue to increase, and it's largely driven by deinstitutionalization from the prison system. We're getting a lot, we're closing prisons, and the prison and jail populations are going way down, which is a good thing. But once again, we're repeating the same mistakes we did when we deinstitutionalized psychiatric centers. We're just not creating enough housing for the population to match how many people are coming out. And so that really is it in a nutshell. And it takes time to create housing. I think that the tenant-friendly rent laws, I was really glad to see that got passed a few years ago. But some landlords have responded by taking apartments off the market, and so that's not good. And I'm hoping that this administration can act creatively and try really hard to bring those units back online and make them available to people who are homeless or at risk. We'll see.
What I was going to say in response to Rich was that the communities, my information is dated, but Community Service Society used to have pretty good resources discussing homelessness. The other group is the West Side Campaign Against Hunger. I mean, it used to be that you could go in and volunteer, and you would hear a lot of stories about just how people had gotten into situations. And it ranged from, well, there were a lot of different stories. So both of those are good sources for some information about people ending up homeless.
Yeah,
Anyway.
that's a good, like, Community Service Society. Sam Stein there is great. He's written a couple books. He's been working on this hotel issue a lot, but he's a great resource on these kinds of issues and the history and everything. That's a good idea.
Madelyn and I work very closely with Victor Bach at the Community Service.
Oh, great.
Society.
I love Vic. Yeah.
And, you know, 25% of the residents of the Upper West Side are food insecure, which means they're also Medicaid, they're insecure with their medicine.
Mm-hmm.
They're insecure with their rent.
Mm-hmm.
They're, you know, and they're people like you and me. They're not, you know, necessarily homeless. They're not necessarily mentally ill. They're people that are just not earning enough money.
Well, I mean, like in 1963 or so, they created the Consumer Price Index, and they basically had this breadbasket of needs, and housing was relatively small, and the cost of housing has just grown and grown, partly because it's improved in quality, but mostly because we just haven't built enough of it. And now there's a real shortage nationwide, and especially in cities like New York that make it much more expensive. And now it's, you know, taking like, you know, 50% or more of people's income. And that's a really bad place to be. And I think that our government has been very slow to respond, because rent subsidies have, you know, traditionally been the province of the federal government. And the federal government is 50 different states with 50 different housing problems. And just because California, Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey have housing shortages and everything, Wyoming could care less. And so they've had a very hard time increasing the Section 8 budget. I was really heartened when the Bloomberg administration started saying, okay, we have to fund a locally funded voucher. Then they took it away, which was disastrous with the Advantage program. But now, you know, when I started in this business 30 years ago, and you talked about rent subsidies, cities and states would say, go to Washington, ask for more Section 8, knowing that it was a fool's errand. Now there's a consensus that the city and state should be funding vouchers. And I'm hopeful that, you know, we will continue to grow that until it's an entitlement rather than something that you win the lottery and you get a voucher, because it's not just homeless people that need help paying the rent. You know, so many people are at risk, and having a voucher that will improve the housing stock overall. I mean, some landlords will just stick it in their pocket, but most landlords will improve the quality of the housing they provide if they have more rental income. And so I was disappointed because Albany had a proposal called the Housing Access Voucher Program in this state budget that Brian Kavanaugh also sponsored. And they were trying to get $250 million to start that off. And it didn't pass. Real disappointment, because that would have been a game changer. And hopefully we'll get that one day. Right now we have city FEPs and state FEPs, and we have a lot of Section 8 and a lot of new Section 8 because of COVID. Emergency housing vouchers, there's about 7,000 new vouchers for homeless people. But we need much, much more.
But we save money when we do it, because because if you look at the cost per, you know, it doesn't cost that. You look at what it costs, okay, it's X amount of dollars. But if you look at the children who now have health issues, who are not getting educated, who are not
Yeah.
It's just totally dramatic.
Yeah. I mean,
So
I
Polly-
was, go
Polly
ahead.
and I, before one of the, I don't remember what the commission was, Polly, when the building at Riverside Center, we were getting 220 units of affordable housing that really weren't affordable. And we went before whatever the board was, and we requested some additional help. And we're like, no one's ever come to us before. And we're like in shock because we were just asking for basic needs for these people.
Yeah. No, I know. And I think government needs to just acknowledge that housing costs have gotten so high that it really is part of the entitlement basket that they need to be providing for, just like Medicare, Medicaid, and cash assistance and other things. The amount of savings that you achieve just by people going to people who are in housing get primary care doctors. People who are homeless go to emergency rooms. Right there, you could pay for that housing just from the money you save from the emergency room. And when they get admitted into the hospital, they stay another week because there's no safe sanitary place for them to go to. That would pay for the cost of the housing. We were able to make that argument a few years back, and we got the Medicaid budget. Governor Cuomo had done this Medicaid redesign team because when he first came into office, he had an $8 billion deficit and 40% of the state's budget was Medicaid. So he had to come up with savings, and we convinced him and his people that that supportive housing could help him reduce Medicaid costs. And so they started smaller, but eventually we ended up spending $660 million of Medicaid savings on supportive housing. And that was a great investment. All these people came with these ideas for saving Medicaid. Supportive housing was one of the few that actually proved to actually save money once they implemented it. So my hope is that one day Medicaid could pay for housing. It's a long way away. But we now have a law in the federal government where they allow housing-based services to be reimbursed by Medicaid, not the rent, but the services in supportive housing can theoretically be reimbursed by Medicaid. And if we can get Medicaid to pay for housing, if housing was a pill, everybody would prescribe it. It creates such better health outcomes, but we haven't been able to make that leap from the Medicaid budget into a housing budget. So more work to be done.
Absolutely. That would be amazing. Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing all your ideas for us. This has really been exciting. And
my pleasure.
Our pleasure. And I think
Shelley has put his
we'll be
hand
in
up.
touch. Thank you very much.
Louisa, Shelley
Yes.
has his hand up.
One more question?
Absolutely.
Well, Ted, how you doing, Ted? Shelley,
How are you,
fine.
Shelley?
Okay.
Yeah.
I just also in response to what was said, the reduction in mental health beds statewide and the de-incarceration, the answer right away is not supportive housing. It's a transitional situation to help people adjust back into society. And those facilities have not been developed. They're easier, I think, to develop. And it's in our recommendations, our CB7 recommendations for mental health at the city council now. The question is, then what? Okay. And a lot of the then what may be easier to answer if you have people who are more ready for it.
Yeah.
A lot of the people on the street are coming from all different places, okay, for all different reasons. But once people are homeless for a certain amount of time, there inevitably mental health issues. So it is a health issue.
Yeah.
Okay. And then it's more complicated. And so we're causing problems all the time, unfortunately. And fortunately, through Westside Federation, we've been able to address some of these things. A part of, besides our housing, we have social workers, and we've had programs where we give assistance to people in the community who are not in our programs. I think there's a need for more of that too.
No, I agree. I was talking to a reporter on the drive down, and he was asking, how can we place people on the streets right into housing? And I said, well, I have placed people from the streets directly into housing, but it's the exception, not the rule. And, even from a logistical perspective, it's tough to do. You usually need transitional setting. Our problem now is that so many people are using the shelter system as a housing program, because they're living in shelter for years, families and single adults. And that's terrible for them. And it's terrible for the taxpayer, because that's a very expensive thing. So I think the answer is still creating more housing, but I think also what we're finding is the people, when I first started in 1990, the state had 20,000 psychiatric center beds. We're now down to 2,000 and change. I mean, the pendulum has swung too far. And some of my civil rights friends would say, no, state hospitals are terrible places, and they are. But the fact is that the street homeless population we're seeing is more floridly psychotic than I've ever seen. And it's, I think everybody is housing ready, provided they have enough services. But, sometimes I see people, and I'm challenged to continue to believe that, because we don't necessarily have the housing models for them yet. And they need more intensive services, and we don't have the proper facilities yet for a lot of them.
Thank you.
Robert?
You always want it special for somebody, but I feel like this really hit hard, and it feels.
All right. Well, so are we wrapping up then?
I think so. Robert, you didn't have, your hand is still up.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, I have a million questions, but we're not going to keep them here all night.
Okay.
All right. Good.
This was
Thank you all.
And thank you so very, very much. It's been incredibly informative, and thank you for your time, and thank you for your knowledge.
Oh, no, I mean,
Very
my
good.
pleasure. It's always good to talk with you anytime.
It's great. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right.
Okay. Good night,
Talk to you.
everybody.